For 5 years, they were an unstoppable force, a hit machine that challenged Nashville and won. So why were they leaving them as a crucial but often overlooked chapter in the history they helped write? Was it the scandal of a teenage marriage in a conservative police department? Or was their crime that outsiders were beating Nashville at its own game? Was the real scandal unfolding behind closed doors, a professional partnership that was also a personal collapse that unfolded in secret? This isn't just a story about forgotten stars. This is an investigation. What or who killed the careers of Johnny and Jonie Mosby? The investigation into that collapse didn't begin in a Nashville recording studio. It began decades earlier in a world that was also collapsing. John Robert Mosby was born on April 26, 1929, in Fort Smith, Arkansas, a gritty border town perched on the edge of the Great Plains, where the South bleeds into the West. He was born into a world on the brink of collapse. Just 6 months after his birth, the stock market crashed in a distant city called New York, an event that sent a shock wave of despair across the nation, plunging it into the Great Depression. For a state like Arkansas, already one of the poorest in the Union, the effect was cataclysmic. Unemployment skyrocketed to nearly 30%. Cotton prices plummeted, small farms choked by debt and drought, failed by the thousands. A deep sense of hopelessness settled over the land, like the dust from the parched fields, a fine, gritty powder that seemed to coat every surface and cloud, every dream. Johnny's family was caught in this maelstrom. His father was a railroad man, a blue-collar worker whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of hard labor, a man who understood the world through the simple, brutal logic of physical effort. His mother was a homemaker, the quiet center of a family struggling to stay afloat in a sea of uncertainty. They were a family of simple means and even simpler pleasures. There was no money for movies or store-bought toys, but there was always music. Music was the currency of the poor, a treasure that couldn't be repossessed by the bank, a source of solace that couldn't be withered by the drought. In the evenings, after a long day of back-breaking work, Johnny's father, a man with a surprisingly gentle singing voice, would entertain neighbors with old folk ballads passed down through generations, tales of love, loss, and murder that seemed to echo the hardships of their own lives. His mother, a woman of deep and abiding faith, filled their small home with the sound of gospel hymns, songs of redemption that offered a glimmer of hope in a world that seemed to offer little else. This was Johnny's first musical education, an inheritance of the soul. But the most powerful musical force in young Johnny's life came from a crackling magical box in the corner of the living room. The radio was a portal, an escape from the four walls of their small house and the grim realities of their daily life. And from that portal, through the static and the hum, came the voices of country music's first true gods. There was Jimmy Rogers, the singing brakeman, a consumptive drifter from Mississippi, whose mournful blue yodels seemed to capture the profound loneliness of a displaced and wandering nation. His songs were filled with the click-clack of the railroad tracks, the sound of both escape and exile. And then there was a young, haunted singer from Alabama named Hank Williams, a man whose voice seemed to carry the weight of every broken heart in America. His songs of heartbreak, sin, and fleeting joy were not just entertainment. They were raw, honest, and utterly transfixing confessions. These were not just singers to Johnny, they were prophets, men who were articulating the pain and longing he saw in the eyes of the adults around him. He began to sing along, his young voice instinctively mimicking their phrasing, their mournful bends, absorbing their stories of a hard-won life into his own DNA. By the late 1930s, The situation in Arkansas had become untenable. The promise of work had evaporated. Like hundreds of thousands of others from the Dust Bowl states, the Mosby family likely joined one of the great and desperate migrations in American history. They became part of a wave of humanity that John Steinbeck would immortalize in The Grapes of Wrath. They packed their meager belongings into whatever vehicle they could afford, left behind the only home they had ever known, and headed west on Route 66, chasing the rumor of work and the myth of a better life in the golden land of California. They settled in the San Fernando Valley, a then burgeoning agricultural and suburban region in Los Angeles County. But the promised land was not as welcoming as the postcard suggested. They were outsiders, part of a massive influx of over 50,000 fellow migrants, and they were met with a cold, often cruel suspicion. The established locals, themselves struggling with the lingering effects of the Depression, looked down upon these newcomers, derisively labeling them Okies and Arkies, terms that dripped with condescension. This experience of being an outsider, a transplant from the poor, rural South into the slick, fast-paced world of Southern California, would shape Johnny Mosby for the rest of his life. According to family accounts that would surface in his obituary decades later, he was teased mercilessly in his new school for his thick Southern accent. This early painful ridicule made him shy and deeply introverted. He learned to speak less, to observe more, to keep his thoughts and feelings locked away. But while he grew quiet in conversation, he found his true, uninhibited voice in music. The guitar became his armor, and music became his voice. It was the one language where his Arkansas drawl was not a mark of shame, but the very source of his power. He could not change the world that judged him, so he built a new one out of 3 chords and the truth. It was the one place he could speak his truth without fear of being judged. After graduating from high school in the late 1940s, as America was roaring into a new era of post-war prosperity, Johnny threw himself into the burgeoning honky-tonk scene. This wasn't the polished, family-friendly country music of the grand old Opry that was being broadcast from Nashville. This was a grittier, louder, more electric sound, played in the smoky, beer-soaked bars that catered to the massive population of transplanted Southerners and blue-collar factory workers who had flocked to California for jobs in the defense industry. Influenced by the Western swing of Texas innovators like Bob Wills and Spade Cooley, California honky-tonk was music for dancing, for drinking, for forgetting the hardships of the work week. It was a sound with a driving beat, weeping steel guitars, and twanging Telecasters. Johnny spent his days working a series of manual labor jobs to make ends meet, a life of sweat and routine that echoed his father's. But his nights belonged to the music. He played in countless clubs up and down the state, honing his skills, developing a reputation as a solid, reliable guitarist with a voice that carried the genuine, undeniable ache of his Arkansas upbringing. Some of his musician friends from that era would later recall that Johnny, in his quiet desperation to play, would sometimes write small melodies or instrumental hooks for other local bands without credit, just for the chance to sit in with them for a few songs. It was a testament to a humility born of hardship, a pure love for the music that transcended ego or ambition. His long, winding journey had finally led him to the undisputed epicenter of this new musical world, a now legendary club in North Hollywood that was the sacred ground, the Carnegie Hall, the cathedral of West Coast country, the Palomino Club. While Johnny Mosby was forging his identity in the crucible of the Great Depression and the prejudice of migration, a completely different California story was just beginning. Janice Irene Shields, the girl who the world would come to know as Jonie Mosby, was born on August 10, 1940, in Van Nuys, a comfortable middle-class suburb in the heart of the San Fernando Valley. She was born into the very world that Johnny's family had traveled 1,000 desperate miles to find. Her father was an office worker, a man who had secured a small but stable piece of the American dream. Her mother was a homemaker, and her childhood was one of post-war stability, opportunity, and optimism. Joanie grew up in a California supercharged by the industrial boom of World War II. It was a world shaped by the pervasive glamour of nearby Hollywood, a place where dreams were manufactured on sound stages and stars were made overnight. But in the Shields household, the soundtrack was pure, unadulterated country. Her parents were devoted fans, their radio perpetually tuned to stations like KNX, which played the hits of Hank Williams, Bob Wills, and, most importantly, the foundational harmonies of the Carter family. They saw a spark, a special gift in their young daughter, and they nurtured it with a gentle, loving encouragement from her earliest days. While Johnny learned to sing out of a desperate need to be heard, Joanie learned to sing from a place of joy and unconditional support. She was, by all accounts, a prodigy. By the age of 5, she was already a fixture in local church services, her pure, clear voice effortlessly finding the high, lonesome harmony parts to the Carter family songs her mother taught her. At just 10 years old in 1950, she entered a talent show at Van Nuys High School. She walked onto the stage, a small girl with a big voice, and delivered a performance of Wildwood Flower that stunned the audience with its emotional maturity and technical precision. She wasn't just imitating the records she heard. She was interpreting the lyrics, channeling a sense of heartache that seemed far beyond her years. By her early teens, her ambition had blossomed. She formed a small group with her friends, the Shields Sisters, a homespun country gospel act that became a popular attraction at local fairs and community events. Joanie was a product of the unique cultural melting pot of Southern California. She had absorbed the traditional country and gospel sounds that her parents loved, but she was also surrounded by the slick pop music on the radio and the burgeoning rock and roll scene that was captivating her generation. This fusion created in her a unique and modern sensibility, a sound that was deeply rooted in tradition but had a contemporary pop-friendly sheen. She represented a new generation of West Coast artists who were unconsciously creating a sound that was distinct from the raw, unvarnished traditionalism of Nashville. But even in this comfortable suburban world, there were subtle pressures and prejudices that would shape her artistic identity. In a 1991 radio interview for the Grand Ole Opry, Joanie recalled the quiet sexism of the era. As she began to venture into the more professional music scene, she was often told by club owners and male musicians that her voice was too soft or too pretty for the rough and tumble masculine world of honky-tonk music. This criticism didn't discourage her. It ignited a fire in her. It forged in her a fierce determination to prove that a woman could not only sing country music, but could command a stage with as much power, authority, and grit as any man. This ambition, this desire to prove the doubters wrong, led her, in 1955, at the astonishingly young age of 15, to the one place in Los Angeles where a young country singer could truly test their mettle and make their name. It was the place where record deals were made, where future stars were born, and where the heart of West Coast country music beat the loudest. Her journey, like Johnny's, had led her inevitably to the swinging doors of the Palomino Club. Two roads, one that began in the dust of Arkansas, the other in the sunshine of a California suburb, were about to intersect on a smoky, beer-soaked stage in North Hollywood. What would happen when the quiet, world-weary grit of the Dust Bowl finally met the fiery, sun-drenched ambition of a California prodigy. It was the collision of earth and fire, a spark that would ignite a perfect and ultimately heartbreaking harmony. The Palomino Club in the 1950s was more than just a bar. It was a cultural institution, an unholy cathedral of country music. It was the Grand Ole Opry of the West Coast, a gritty, unpretentious temple where the raw, electrified sound of California honky-tonk was being born every single night. The clientele was a perfect cross-section of post-war Los Angeles. Cowboys in pearl-snap shirts who had never roped a steer, factory workers from the nearby Lockheed plant washing away the grime of the week, young couples learning to two-step on the crowded dance floor, and a healthy smattering of aspiring musicians, all watching, listening, and learning. On any given night, you might see a young, hungry Buck Owens nursing a beer at the bar, or a pre-fame Merle Haggard taking notes in a corner booth. It was a place where future legends came to pay their respects and test their mettle. And for years, the man at the center of this creative storm, the leader of the house band in this chaotic, thrilling universe, was a seasoned 25-year-old guitarist from Arkansas named Johnny Mosby. As the leader of the Palomino's house band, he was more than just another musician. He was a gatekeeper, a respected veteran who had seen hundreds of hopefuls come and go. His job was to keep the dance floor full and the beer flowing, a relentless 6 nights a week grind that had honed his skills to a razor's edge and given him a profound, almost cynical understanding of what it took to survive in this business. Legend has it that in June of 1955, on a typically rowdy weeknight, a 15-year-old girl with a worn guitar case in one hand and a look of fierce, unblinking determination in her eyes walked through those swinging doors. It was Joni Shields. For a young woman from the quiet suburbs of Van Nuys, stepping into the masculine, beer-soaked world of the Palomino must have been like stepping onto another planet. It was an intimidating environment, a place that could be notoriously tough on newcomers, especially a teenage girl. She was there for an open audition, a chance to sing one song with the house band. When her name was called, a few regulars likely snickered. But then she stepped onto that small, sticky stage, strapped on her guitar, and leaned into the microphone. A hush fell over the rowdy crowd. The voice that poured out of her was a complete and utter revelation. It wasn't just pretty. It was powerful. It was a voice that possessed the crystal clarity of the gospel hymns she was raised on, yet it was infused with the raw, lonesome ache of the Carter family ballads she loved. It was, as one observer would later describe it, like hearing a gospel canon in a honky-tonk. Johnny Mosby, standing at the side of the stage, ready to lead his band through another forgettable audition, was stopped dead in his tracks. In his years at the Palomino, he had heard hundreds of singers. He had heard the wannabes, the amateurs, the professionals, but he had never heard anything like this. He heard in her voice the perfect, luminous counterpart to his own earthy, world-weary baritone. He saw not just a talented kid, but the missing piece of his own musical puzzle, the high, lonesome harmony to his low, bluesy melody. The audition was over before she had even finished the first chorus. The musical chemistry was instantaneous, intuitive, and undeniable. Johnny hired her on the spot as a featured vocalist with the house band, and they almost immediately began working up duet numbers. Their harmonies were a thing of natural, almost startling beauty. It was a seamless blend that felt as if they had been singing together their entire lives, a perfect fusion of his southern grit and her California grace. He was the anchor, his steady, driving rhythm guitar and warm, confident voice providing the solid foundation. She was the fire, her soaring, emotional vocals and vibrant stage presence, giving the music its heart and its explosive soul. The patrons of the Palomino, a notoriously tough crowd to impress, were witnessing the birth of something special, and they knew it. The professional partnership, forged under the hot, bright lights of the stage, quickly and intensely blossomed into a personal one. The 10-year age gap, which might have seemed significant in the outside world, seemed to melt away in the face of their shared passion and the undeniable magnetic connection they had. Their courtship was not one of quiet dinners and movie dates. It was a whirlwind of late-night sets, shared microphones, and long conversations in the pre-dawn hours after the club had closed. He was the seasoned mentor, guiding her through the treacherous protocols of the music business. She was the prodigious talent, inspiring him with her raw, uninhibited artistry. But this relationship existed in the accelerated, often reckless world of show business, a world that rarely adheres to conventional timelines. Things move fast, perhaps too fast. In January of 1958, Johnny, now 28, and Joni, still just 17 years old, were married in a small Methodist ceremony. A year later, in 1959, their first child, a daughter also named Joni, was born. In the blink of an eye, Jonie Mosby had gone from a high school student with a dream to a professional singer, a wife, and a mother, all before she was 20 years old. The pressures were immense, a reality that would become a central, recurring theme of their lives together, planting the seeds for future conflicts, even in the midst of their burgeoning love story. Their overwhelming popularity at the Palomino inevitably led to interest from record labels. In 1958, they signed their first recording contract with Challenge Records, a small but ambitious local label best known for the hit Tequila by the Champs. Now officially billed as Johnny and Jonie Mosby, they stepped into a professional recording studio for the first time. It was a huge step, a chance to capture their magic on vinyl and send it out to the rest of the country. However, the transition from a live honky-tonk act to a recording duo proved to be a difficult one. Their early singles for Challenge failed to capture the raw, electric energy of their Palomino performances. The producers, accustomed to a more polished sound, seemed unsure of how to market their unique, gritty style. The recordings often felt thin and tentative, a pale imitation of the powerhouse act that was packing the Palomino every night. It was a frustrating period of near misses and commercial disappointments, a stark lesson in the difference between live chemistry and recorded success. Their first taste of national recognition finally came in late 1959 with a song called "I'll Leave the Weepin' to You." It was a classic country weeper, a tale of heartbreak that perfectly suited their harmony. However, the song, like their other early singles, failed to gain national traction or crack the Billboard charts. It wasn't a smash hit, but it was a crucial foothold. It was validation. It proved that their sound could connect with an audience beyond the city limits of Los Angeles. That minor chart success was enough to get them on the national touring circuit for the first time. They left the relative comfort of their residency at the Palomino and hit the road. This was the true beginning of the grind. Life on the road in the late 1950s and early 1960s was anything but glamorous. It was a life of endless miles in a cramped station wagon, of cheap roadside motels that all looked the same, of greasy spoon diners, and of playing in a different town every single night. This grueling schedule was particularly difficult for Joni, now a young mother trying to raise a baby on a tour bus, juggling the endless demands of motherhood with the exhausting pressures of a burgeoning career. The fatigue and the strain were constant companions, testing the limits of their endurance and their relationship. By the early 1960s, It had become painfully clear that if they were ever going to break through to the next level of stardom, they had hit a ceiling. They were bona fide stars on the West Coast, but they were struggling for airplay in the rest of the country. The West Coast scene was vibrant, but it lacked the national promotional machinery that was firmly centralized in Nashville. They were big fish in a small, albeit critically important pond. Their raw honky-tonk style was also increasingly out of step with the dominant sound coming out of Music City. The Nashville sound, pioneered by producers like Chet Atkins and Owen Bradley, was polished, smooth, and often featured lush string arrangements and pop-style background vocals. It was a sound designed for crossover appeal, and it was a world away from the twanging Telecasters and weeping steel guitars of the Palomino Club. Johnny and Joanie were at a crossroads. They could remain beloved regional stars, or they could take a massive gamble. They could take their unapologetically Californian sound and try to sell it to the heart of the Nashville establishment. Their contract with Challenge Records ended in 1962, providing the perfect opportunity. Their manager, a believer in their immense talent, secured them a meeting with one of the most powerful and respected producers in Nashville, a man named Don Law. Law was a legend at Columbia Records, the man responsible for producing a staggering list of hits for icons like Johnny Cash, Lefty Frizzle, and Ray Price. The meeting was a make-or-break moment. They played their songs for Law, not with a slick demo, but with the raw, honest conviction they had perfected over thousands of hours on stage. Don Law, a man with an uncanny ear for authenticity, heard what Challenge Records had missed. He didn't hear a regional act that needed to be polished and reshaped in the Nashville mold. He heard a duo with a unique, powerful, and undeniably commercial sound. He heard the sound of the future. In June of 1962, Johnny and Jonie Mosby signed a major recording contract with Columbia Records. They had finally gotten their ticket to the big time. They were about to take Nashville by storm, California style, and nothing would ever be the same. The Palomino Club had been their crucible, the vibrant, chaotic laboratory where their professional and personal lives had been fused into one inseparable entity. After years of paying their dues, of honing their craft through thousands of hours on that legendary stage, they had finally been called up to the major leagues. A contract with Columbia Records was more than just a piece of paper. It was a passport to a different universe. But Nashville was not the Palomino. It was a city of established rules, immense corporate power, and towering, almost mythical legends. The question was no longer if they were good enough, but if their raw, unapologetic West Coast sound could conquer the very heart of the country music establishment. They were on the verge of their golden age, a brief, brilliant period of triumph that would elevate them to the highest echelon of stardom. Signing with Columbia Records in 1963 was, in the parlance of the time, like being called up from the minor leagues to play for the New York Yankees. It was a quantum leap. Johnny and Jonie Mosby were now swimming in the deepest part of the pool, part of a formidable roster that included some of the biggest and most influential names in American music. Their new label mate was the formidable, enigmatic Johnny Cash, a man who was in the process of transcending country music to become a global icon. The pressure to deliver, to prove that they belonged in such elite company, must have been immense. Their new producer, the legendary Don Law, was a man who had heard it all. He was an Englishman who had improbably become one of the chief architects of the post-war country sound. He was not a man easily impressed, but in Johnny and Joanie he saw something that Nashville was sorely lacking: a raw, unvarnished authenticity, an electric energy born from the honky-tonks, not from a producer's carefully crafted arrangement. His instruction to them was simple and profound. He didn't want them to change a thing. He didn't try to smooth out their rough edges or sand down their twang. He encouraged them to lean into the raw, energetic West Coast style they had perfected over thousands of hours on the stage of the Palomino. He wanted to capture lightning in a bottle. The result of this new partnership, this fusion of West Coast fire and Nashville power, was an immediate and explosive breakthrough. In April of 1963, they released their first single for Columbia, a song that would become their calling card, "Don't Call Me from a Honky Tonk." The song was a perfect vehicle for their unique dynamic. It was an up-tempo, cleverly written story of a fed-up wife laying down the law to her carousing husband, a narrative that crackled with a playful, defiant, and thoroughly modern energy. The star of the show was Jonie's powerhouse vocal. This was not the demure, heartbroken female voice that was so common on country radio at the time. This was a declaration of independence. She sang with the authority and conviction of a woman who was not afraid to speak her mind, a perfect embodiment of the strong, assertive female perspective she had always wanted to project. Johnny's steady, knowing harmony and the band's driving Telecaster-led rhythm provided the perfect frame for her tour de force performance. "Don't Call Me from a Honky Tonk" was a smash. It was a sound that was at once traditional and refreshingly new. It shot up the Billboard country charts, climbing all the way to number 12 and selling over 100,000 copies. For Johnny and Jonie, it was the validation they had been working towards their entire lives. Suddenly, they were everywhere. They were no longer just the house band at the Palomino. They were national recording artists, their voices crackling out of radios in Texas, New York, and everywhere in between. Columbia Records, realizing they had a hit on their hands, moved quickly to capitalize on the momentum. Just a few months later, they followed up their breakthrough with another compelling top 20 hit, the equally assertive "Trouble in My Arms." Their debut album for Columbia, simply titled Johnny and Jonie Mosby, was released in October of 1963. While the album itself did not crack the top 10, it was propelled by its strong singles and cemented their status as a remarkable success story. They had arrived, and they had done it on their own terms. They were now part of a powerful wave of West Coast artists, but their sound remained distinct. While contemporaries like Buck Owens and Merle Haggard were forging the gritty, rock-influenced Bakersfield sound in the clubs, Johnny and Jonie's style was softer, leaning more toward the polished, harmony-driven sound favored by Nashville. They were now in a relentless cycle of recording and touring, playing to ever larger and more adoring crowds across the country. The pressure was immense. The demands of fame began to take a toll, particularly on Johnny. The shy boy from Arkansas was now a public figure, a role he never seemed entirely comfortable with. The stress of the road led to an increase in his drinking, a common but dangerous coping mechanism in the high-pressure world of the music business. It was a small, almost unnoticeable crack in the foundation of their success, a shadow that would slowly lengthen in the years to come. Despite the personal pressures, their professional ascent continued with breathtaking speed. In 1964 and 1965, they were a constant presence on the country charts, releasing a string of successful and memorable singles. They released the heartfelt ballad, "Just Hold My Hand," which earned them a Grammy nomination, and the classic Cheatin' song, "Loose Talk," their harmonies dripping with suspicion and heartache. Their music was celebrated for its honesty, its energy, and most of all, for their flawless harmony. They were becoming one of the most respected and commercially successful duos in all of country music. This incredible run of success led them inevitably to the doorstep of the genre's most sacred and exclusive institution. After 5 triumphant guest appearances on its hallowed stage, where they consistently won over the notoriously tough traditionalist Nashville audience with their electrifying performances, they received the call that every country musician dreams of. In January of 1965, Johnny and Jonie Mosby were officially invited to become members of the Grand Ole Opry. This was the ultimate validation. This was the moment that the Dust Bowl migrant and the California girl were officially and permanently welcomed into the very heart of the country music establishment. It was a symbolic and deeply emotional coronation. They packed their bags, made the difficult decision to leave the West Coast behind, and moved their young family to a home in Gallatin, Tennessee, a quiet suburb of Nashville. They had conquered the mountain. They were standing on the summit, the entire world of country music at their feet. But as they would soon discover in the treacherous landscape of fame, staying on top is often a far more difficult and far more precarious journey than the climb. They had done it. The outsiders from California had conquered Nashville, not by conforming, but by being defiantly themselves. They were hit makers, cherished members of the Grand Ole Opry, the undisputed king and queen of West Coast country. They were standing on the summit of the country music world, the dream they had chased for so long, now a glittering reality. But in the turbulent, fast-moving, and merciless world of the 1960s, the summit is a precarious place. The cultural and musical ground was already shifting beneath their feet, and the perfect, seemingly unbreakable harmony they shared on stage was about to be tested by the immense pressures of fame and the slow, inexorable erosion of time. The climb had been glorious, but the struggle to stay on top would prove to be a far more difficult and ultimately heartbreaking battle. And that precarious journey began almost immediately. By the mid-1960s, Johnny and Jonie Mosby were living a life that would have been unimaginable to the poor boy from Arkansas and the ambitious girl from the California suburbs. They were bona fide stars, cherished members of the Grand Ole Opry, their names spoken in the same breath as the legends they had once idolized. They had a beautiful home in the rolling hills of Tennessee, a healthy daughter, and a string of hit records that had made their unique West Coast sound a beloved part of the national conversation. They had done the impossible. They had conquered Nashville on their own terms. But summits are cold, windswept, and precarious places. The very forces that had propelled them to the top were already beginning to shift, creating tremors beneath their feet that would eventually shake their entire world to its foundations. The latter half of the 1960s was a period of unprecedented cultural and musical upheaval. The world was changing at a dizzying speed, and the cozy, predictable universe of country music was not immune. The British invasion, which had started as a pop phenomenon, had mutated into a full-blown psychedelic revolution. Bands like the Beatles, with their groundbreaking album Revolver, were rewriting the very language of popular music. At the same time, within country music itself, a new guard was rising. In Nashville, the producer Billy Sherrill was creating a new, incredibly successful formula known as countrypolitan. It was a lush, sophisticated sound, often featuring dramatic string sections, perfectly tailored for crossover pop success. He was turning artists like Tammy Wynette into superstars with heart-wrenching anthems that, while brilliant, were a world away from the raw, honky-tonk grit of Johnny and Jonie's music. For an act as unapologetically traditional in their instrumentation as Johnny and Jonie, this new landscape was becoming increasingly hostile. Their sound, once so fresh, began to be perceived by radio programmers as dated. The first sign of this changing tide was a subtle but significant shift in their chart performance. While they remained a hugely popular live act and a beloved presence on the Opry, the new hits stopped coming. Throughout the late 1960s, their record label, Columbia, would periodically reissue their older classic hits. These reissues would often scrape into the lower rungs of the charts, a testament to the enduring loyalty of their core fan base. But for an artist, this is a bittersweet kind of success. It's a confirmation that the public loves who you were, not who you are. They were becoming a nostalgia act while still in their creative prime, a deeply frustrating position to be in. The lack of new hits created a growing friction with their record label. Columbia began to pour their promotional budget into their newer, hotter acts. Johnny and Joanie, once the darlings of the label, found themselves increasingly marginalized, fighting for attention, fighting for quality material, fighting to stay relevant. Their final albums for Columbia during this period, like 1969's I'll Never Be Free, were met with label indifference and failed to make a significant commercial impact. The hit-making machine had slowed to a crawl, and the frustrations began to mount, seeping from their professional lives into the very heart of their personal partnership. This professional decline acted as a powerful catalyst, exacerbating the personal and creative pressures that had been building beneath the surface for years. The constant touring, once a thrilling adventure, was now a grueling grind. Their daughter, Joanie, was now a young girl, and the strain of raising a child on the road, of being absent parents even when they were in the same room, weighed heavily on both of them. Johnny's struggles with alcohol, a common coping mechanism in the high-stress world of the music business, reportedly worsened during this period of decline. For a man who had pulled himself up from the poverty of the Dust Bowl, the slow fade from the spotlight must have felt like a personal failure. The quiet, introverted boy from Arkansas, who had never seemed entirely comfortable with stardom, now found himself fighting to hold on to it, a battle that was likely waged both in the boardrooms of Music Row and in the bottom of a bottle. But a significant source of conflict may well have been creative. It's plausible that the very dynamic that had created their perfect harmony in the beginning, his seasoned, traditionalist experience and her fiery, youthful talent, now became the fault line along which their partnership began to fracture. Johnny, as the elder and the established bandleader, was a traditionalist at heart. His instinct was to stick with what had worked. For him, the new trends in country music were a betrayal of the genre's roots. Joanie, however, was a different story. She was a full decade younger, and she had grown from a teenage prodigy into a confident, ambitious woman with her own artistic vision. She saw the world of music changing, and she likely felt a powerful urge for their music to evolve with it. The old formula, which had once felt like a comfortable home, now began to feel like a creative straitjacket. She reportedly grew frustrated with Johnny's more rigid approach and yearned for more creative input, for a chance to be seen as a true artistic partner, not just the girl singer in the duo. The harmony on stage was still perfect, but the harmony in the recording studio and in their private lives was becoming increasingly dissonant. In 1970, in a bold and perhaps desperate move to reignite their career, they left Columbia Records and signed with Capitol Records. It was a chance for a fresh start, a Hail Mary pass designed to break them out of their commercial slump. But their first album for their new label, prophetically titled Make a Left and Then a Right, was a commercial failure. The title itself seemed to capture their creative dilemma. They were searching for a new direction, but the map was gone. In March of 1971, they released what would be their final charting single, a cover of the classic Don and Dewey song, I'm Leavin' It Up to You. The song, a classic duet theme of romantic indecision, was now freighted with a heavy unspoken irony. It felt less like a story song and more like a public negotiation, a sad, weary confession of a partnership at its breaking point. The single stalled at a heartbreaking number 64 on the charts. The writing was on the wall. The next 2 years were a period of professional limbo and personal turmoil. They fulfilled their contractual obligations, but the joy was gone. Finally, in June of 1973, after 15 years and 17 chart singles, Johnny and Jonie Mosby made an announcement that shocked the country music world. They were officially and permanently breaking up the duo. Jonie announced her intention to pursue a solo career, while Johnny expressed a desire to focus on production. It was presented to the public as an amicable professional parting of the ways. But for their devoted fans, it felt like a divorce. The perfect, unbreakable harmony had been shattered. And as Joanie would quickly discover, the voice that had been so powerful as one half of a whole would face a lonely, uphill battle to be heard on its own. And so the music stopped. The perfect harmony that had defined their lives and careers for 15 years had finally unraveled under the immense weight of professional disappointment and deeply personal strain. The partnership was over. The duo was no more, but the story was not. For Johnny and for Jonie Mosby, the most difficult and perhaps most revealing chapter was just beginning. The long, quiet aftermath. What happens when a star's brilliant light is extinguished? How do two people, whose public and private identities were so completely and inextricably intertwined, learn to walk alone? The final act of their story would be one of two very different paths, one of quiet, anonymous retreat, and one of steadfast, lonely, and deeply noble endurance. What happens to a voice when its echo is gone? What happens to one half of a perfect whole when the other half walks away? For Jonie Mosby, the breakup of the duo was not just a career change, it was an existential crisis. Her entire adult life, her entire professional identity had been defined by that harmony. She was Joanie of Johnny and Jonie. Now, in the harsh, unforgiving glare of the Nashville spotlight, she had to discover who Jonie Mosby was on her own. She launched her solo career in 1974 with the full backing of her new label, MCA Records, and a reservoir of goodwill from the industry. She was still a phenomenal singer, a seasoned, charismatic performer, and a beloved member of the Opry family. On paper, she had all the ingredients for success. Her debut solo album, pointedly titled I'm Not Strong Enough, was a collection of well-crafted songs that showcased her powerful voice. But the momentum, that magical, intangible chemistry that had propelled the duo to stardom, was gone. The album and its singles failed to gain significant traction. The country music landscape had shifted dramatically. The airwaves were now dominated by the pop crossover sound of artists like Olivia Newton-John and John Denver, and the raw outlaw rebellion of Willie Nelson and Waylon Jennings. Joanie's brand of sophisticated West Coast honky-tonk, once so fresh and exciting, now found itself caught in a commercial no man's land. The public, it seemed, was not interested in the individual notes. They missed the chord. In a moment of deep and painful irony, the only significant chart success Joanie experienced as a solo artist came in 1975, when a reissue of her classic duet hit Don't Call Me from a Honky Tonk inexplicably climbed the charts again. It was a ghostly echo from the past, a bittersweet reminder of the magic she had shared with Johnny, and a stark confirmation that the public was not yet ready to accept her as a standalone star. For the ambitious young woman who had always fought to prove she was more than just the girl singer, this must have been a particularly cruel twist of fate. Her time as a national recording star was over. Faced with the indifference of country radio and the changing tastes of the record-buying public, many artists would have faded into obscurity, bitter and defeated. But Jonie Mosby did something remarkable. Instead of fighting a losing battle for chart success, she chose to embrace a new and perhaps more enduring role. She couldn't conquer the charts, so she chose to conquer the institution. She became a matriarch of the Grand Ole Opry. For the next quarter of a century, Jonie Mosby became one of the most loyal, consistent, and beloved members in the Opry's storied history. The Ryman Auditorium, and later the new Grand Ole Opry House, became her home, the stage her sanctuary. She was a constant and comforting presence, performing dozens of shows a year, her powerful voice a living link to the golden era of the 1960s. She was a keeper of the traditional country flame, a walking, singing embodiment of the music's rich history. In this new role, she flourished. Freed from the pressure of chasing hits, she seemed to find a new sense of peace and purpose. She became an elder stateswoman, a respected figure who would offer a kind word of encouragement to a nervous newcomer or share a knowing laugh backstage with fellow legends like Loretta Lynn and Gene Shepard. She was no longer just a singer. She was a part of the very fabric of Nashville, a thread in the grand tapestry of country music. The Opry gave her what the charts no longer could: a home, a family, and a place where her legacy was not just remembered, but cherished and celebrated every single time she stepped into the circle. She continued to perform regularly until the early 2000s, when declining health forced her into a well-deserved and hard-earned retirement from the stage. Johnny Mosby's path was a much quieter, more solitary one. After the duo broke up, he largely, and it seems willingly, retreated from the public eye. He dabbled in music production for a time, but his heart was no longer in the relentless, high-stakes game of the Nashville music business. He never again sought the spotlight. He had spent his life on the road, chasing a dream that had been born in the poverty of the Depression. He had reached the summit, and he had seen the view. Now it seemed he was content to descend into the quiet valley of a private life. In a move that was both geographically and symbolically significant, he eventually left Tennessee and moved back to California, the state that had first given him his dream, the place where he had met the teenage girl with the powerhouse voice. He had come full circle. The shy, introverted boy from Arkansas, who had found his voice in music, seemed to find his ultimate peace in the restorative power of silence. He lived a life far from the glare of the stage, finding peace in a private life focused on his family, a ghost to the industry that he had so briefly helped to define. The nature of their personal relationship after the professional breakup remains a subject of quiet, respectful speculation among their most devoted fans. While their marriage did end in divorce around the time of their professional breakup, their lives took distinctly and geographically different paths. She remained in the very heart of Nashville, a public figure permanently tied to the legacy of the Opry. He returned to the West Coast, a private citizen who had left that life behind. It was a poignant, real-life reflection of the very first line of their career. Two people from two different worlds whose paths had converged for a brilliant moment, only to diverge once more, each returning to the place that had made them. On February 19, 2018, Johnny Mosby passed away from natural causes in Ventura, California. He was 88 years old. His death was noted quietly in the music press, a respectful but brief acknowledgement of the passing of a veteran from a bygone era. For those who remembered, it was the final silent closing of a chapter, the end of a story that had been for decades only half told. The legacy of Johnny and Jonie Mosby is not one of a long, sustained reign or a fiery, operatic tragedy, but a more subtle, complex, and human story. Theirs is the story of the Great American Migration, a dream forged in the dust of the Great Depression and realized under the California sun. Musically, they were pioneers, creating a unique sound by fusing his grounded, world-weary Arkansas baritone with her soaring, optimistic soprano. This harmony was the literal sound of two worlds colliding, and for a few brief, brilliant years, it captured the heart of a nation. It is also a cautionary tale about the immense pressures of love and ambition in the unforgiving world of show business, a reminder that even the most perfect harmony can shatter under the demands of fame and the changing of the tides. Their greatest legacy is the quintessentially American story itself, of the shy boy with a Southern accent who found his true voice in a guitar, and the ambitious girl who refused to be told her voice was too soft, becoming a queen in a world of kings. In the end, their story was a poignant, heartbreaking circle. It began with two different worlds, finding a shared home in a song, and ended with them returning to the separate worlds that had made them. That harmony, however brief, had once been the most beautiful sound in the world.